we've continued to progress as human beings, as an animal. We've continued to become lower time preference. We've continued to become more future oriented. And then the 20th century comes along and we effectively go back to using this primitive money technology. So we're like these people whose brains can do computers and amazing things, but we're trying to, say, hunt with spear and rock, and it's not going very well. All of our hunting and food production equipment has been replaced with spears and rocks, and we're out there trying to make food work for us. So obviously that's going to be disastrous. And it's something similar to what has happened with money.
Thrilled to have Saifedean with us in the studios. In fact, I don't know if I told you this, but I actually canceled my plans to go back to California. I'm supposed to be in Santa Barbara right now, but I heard you were coming. And I was like, all right, there's no way we're missing this opportunity. So thank you so much for agreeing to sit down with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
It's and I'm sure you know your book, the Bitcoin Standard, is kind of the go-to. It was the thing that really put me over the edge. You know, I was interested in Bitcoin from early days, but after I read your book, I was like, oh, okay, this is just a given. Like, Bitcoin is the natural progression of money, and this fiat period was really the aberration from what money should be. And so I'm always recommending it to everybody, as I know most other Bitcoiners are. So how does that feel for you to know that your book is kind of known as the go-to and has really shaped the Bitcoin space?
It is a little bit weird. It's not something that I was expecting. I mean, I was writing the book just because I felt like I had to write, and because I had to write because, I had to do it for my job. It was not something that I expected to work this way. So it was written really as an academic book. And I did not expect it to get this popular. I didn't think that many people read books. But I guess Bitcoin is a little bit different from the norm. And it's just, it's been surreal. I travel all over the world and people talk about the book. So it's a little surreal, but it's nice. I can't complain.
So did it start off kind of slow and it just kind of kept growing as far as the sales and the exposure of it?
Pretty
or
much,
was it from the
yeah.
get-go?
No, it's kind of grown. So I would say sales went up practically every year except for 2001 to 2002. So 2001 was like a massive year because it was the halving bubble.
21.
Yeah, well, 21 was the price bubble, so came after the halving. So that was like it generally, the sales of the book correlate
Go
pretty
with the
well.
market.
Go well with the market, so they correlate with the market. So it's generally gone up, just like Bitcoin. Number go up technology. The rules everything around me. But then, like, so 21 to 22 was a decline, but then 22 to 23 was also a rise, and I think 24 is probably going to exceed 23 again. So it's just, and practically all of those years from 2020, I think, exceed 2018. So like it's always been more than the beginning. It was a bit of a sleeper hit.
Yeah. I mean, and that's unusual for book sales. Usually at the beginning, there's a big rush and they kind of die off. I bought the Fiat Standard as soon as it was out. I know you were releasing it kind of chapter by chapter. I just felt like, no, I needed to have it all at once. And then I got it and I sat it down and I forgot to read it. And last week when I knew that you were coming, I was like, all right, well, I've got to sit down and read this. I couldn't get the book, so I listened to the audio version. And I'm guessing that book was a lot more work to write than the Bitcoin Standard.
That's true, actually. Yeah. So the Bitcoin Standard was the culmination of ideas that I had been forming about money and economics even before I'd heard about Bitcoin. So some of the stuff that's written in the book is stuff that I had written out in notes and papers that I had just written myself as early as 2008. So there's, for instance, that part where I discuss the work of Milton Friedman, just off the top of my head right now. that stuff is something that I wrote in 2009, I think, or maybe even 2008, when I had read his book. And I wrote this as notes, and I wrote it as a critique of the book, of the main ideas. And I just saved it, and I, thought about publishing it for a while, but it was a little too arcane for most people to care about. It was too Austrian, also. So, and it was just written for me. But then, when I decided to write the Bitcoin Standard, that was 10 years later in 2017. It was in February, and I just decided to write it, and it I started collecting all of these ideas that I had about economics, and Bitcoin helped collate all those ideas, because I'd been thinking about hard money and about gold and about all of that stuff. I'd written stuff like this before. In fact, I'd written big chunks of the book in Arabic back in 2012 and 13 for a report that I was working on, which eventually never really got published. But I had these ideas. So in 2017, the whole project of the book started because I decided that I was going to write 1,000 words a day. So just put it into my head that I'm going to write 1,000 words a day before I even had the idea about the book. And I just had a vague idea that I was going to write about Bitcoin and or about meat, because I'd been a carnivore and I was enjoying the joys of being a carnivore, and I wanted to write about it. And so I had those two ideas, and I just thought, I just need to be pumping out 1,000 words a day, and then something good will happen, either blog posts or books or whatever. So I started off, and I started collecting my ideas about Bitcoin, and I decided quickly that there was going to be a book there. And then just by putting in the 1,000 words a day and just making that the focus, I was able to write that book, or the majority of the book at least, in about 2.5 months. So the book was basically done on April 26th. Actually, that's exactly one day off the 7th anniversary since I finished writing the book, I would say. So I remember it was April 26th that I finished writing the first draft, which was, I would say, 90% of what is in the final book. And I started in February 13th. So it was really 2.5 months, and that I just sat down and I was writing at least 1,000 words a day. And I ended up with about 90,000 words. And then it was later to add a bunch of more chapters over the coming year until the thing was published. But ultimately, the bulk of the work was me putting in all these ideas that I had already worked on for a very long time. And some of it was stuff that I had already written. So I was just copying it and adding it in context. And so I built this thing by just collecting all of the stuff that had been bubbling up inside me for many years, that I couldn't really have a forum for publishing, and I didn't really have the focus for publishing, and because I was sort of lost between academic publication, which I had to try and work on, and was not really working very well because I was just not interested, and it's boring and it's fiat and it's bullshit, and popular publication, which also is something that I hadn't put much time and effort into because I was a mostly fiat person. And so Bitcoin comes along, Bitcoin fixes me, I start putting in the time. And then as long as I just have this low time preference activity of whatever happens today, I'm going to put 1,000 words onto this draft. And I did it so meticulously. I mean, I had an actual Excel sheet where I was counting the word count at the end of each workday, and I had it plotted in a graph, and I had to make sure that it was going up, and that the average, I was calculating the average with every day. And I averaged more than 1,000 a day, and I got it out in. I did manage to write it. So, in a sense, it was exhausting, but it was brief, and it was most of the ideas were already made. And then for the fiat standard, all of this is a long way of saying yes to the answer to your question. For the fiat standard, on the other hand, I just I spent a lot more time working on it and developing the ideas and trying to think about how I could write it into the form of a book. Whereas the Bitcoin standards were more of just, I have all of these ideas, I need to get them out. Now I needed to see, okay, what else? And also I needed to tackle it around a specific question of trying to study fiat. In the same way that I studied Bitcoin, which kind of emerged spontaneously with Bitcoin, because I was just trying to explain Bitcoin, and by trying to write it in a way that I can explain it, I came out with this. But then with the fiat standard, I had to really lay out an outline and decide what I want to do, which was essentially apply what I was doing in the Bitcoin standard to studying fiat, which nobody would do because nobody would think about studying fiat
Yeah.
in that way because fiat just is. We're like
But it helps
fish
it
in
for
the
me. It
fiat
helped
water.
it make sense. Fiat makes sense by looking at it through that lens. It really did simplify it.
Yeah, that's how it worked for me. I think it's just it became clear. Like once you draw analogy to Bitcoin, and that's the whole point of the book, because I think it's a very powerful thought experiment. Because Bitcoin is made by an engineer, fiat is made by history, by millions and billions of people acting and making decisions and inventing things and using things. And so it's this naturally emergent, ugly monster. Whereas Bitcoin was just designed from scratch by an engineer who just sat down and figured out what do we need in order to make a form of money work? Well, we need a way to issue it, we need a way to move it, and we need a way to keep track of it. We need to fix the supply. And in my mind, I think he came up with the optimum money. I can't imagine a better way to improve upon it, other than the kind of obvious ways, which is, you'd want it to have more capacity. It would ideally do 1 million times as many transactions per second as it does. But, physics has its has its rules.
There's those trade-offs.
Yeah, there's those trade-offs. So it was more difficult to apply that to fiat, but it was very, very, very enlightening in my mind, if I may say so myself, because I think you apply those things and then you are able to uncover the essential features of how fiat works. And then once you see that, you can see how that leads to different impacts on everything in our life. And so and a lot of that is alluded to in the Bitcoin standard, but I think what the Bitcoin standard does is present it and explain it as individual phenomena. The fiat standard takes us a step further by presenting the kind of overarching incentive structure that produces these problems. And ultimately, it comes down to the fact that the key idea of the book is that in the fiat system, you mine fiat by issuing debt. So every time you borrow, new fiat is mined. That's how mining works. And if you understand that, if you think that in Bitcoin we have all these miners who spend millions and billions of dollars building all these mining facilities in order to make more Bitcoin, in fiat, we have a banking system that is issuing debt and finding ways of getting more and more people into more and more debt, because every time you issue more debt, you make more money and devalue everyone else's money.
Which 95% of the people don't understand that that's what happens, but yeah.
Yeah, most people don't really. I mean, in a sense,
They don't
you
understand that the banks are creating money every time they loan. Most people I know think the banks have that money and they're just loaning you somebody else's money.
Yeah, no, it is. And it's, of course, the real rabbit hole here is, well, why can't I just have a simple bank that does that? Remember when last year there was that giant collapse of Silicon Valley Bank? And there were all these startups of really smart, hardworking people working on solving important tech problems. Perhaps not all of them, but all of these people were just going to go out of business because all their cash balance was going to go because the bank couldn't handle it. And so a lot of them were asking, well, can't we just have a bank that doesn't gamble with our money, that just holds cash for us and allows us to make payments and allows us to receive payments? And then we can take money out of that bank account and go and gamble when we want to. But we just need a basic utility of a banking app that just allows us to send and keep our money. And you can't do that in fiat. It doesn't work because they can borrow against that money. And if they borrow against that money, they make more money.
Yeah.
And so the incentive for it is too large. You can't just do this.
Well, even the banks that have tried to do that and tried to get a bank charter based on that of not loaning money that they don't have or not making loans at all, the government's denied them the charter. So it's...
Exactly. You can't. You have to operate in a fractional reserve banking system, and they have to supervise that. And the banks that have tried that, they won't let them. So you have to gamble. And of course, you also have to gamble because the money is losing value. So even if those startups were able to do it, I mean, they just want something for kind of short-term money. So it doesn't really matter much because they don't really notice the erosion of the value. But realistically, if, say, you're a company that has $1 million running cash balance in a bank account, just to make payroll and receive payments and so on, if you've got that kind of amount of money, then you're losing a significant amount of money every year through devaluation. And so you need to take risks with
Hmm.
it, and that's what everybody's doing. And so also you don't develop a savings account, because having a saving account is ridiculous. You get an interest rate of 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever it is. You're not going to keep up with
Yeah.
inflation, because the only way that the whole Ponzi works is that you get shafted. So you're not going to go to them and get your fair share out, because if the bank gave positive interest rate that beat inflation to everybody, then what would be the
Yeah.
point of inflation? The whole point is to rob you. So they you cannot put it in the bank. You have to go into the casino of the market. And that's what everybody has to do. And also, it doesn't make sense for you to save up money to buy a house. You just borrow for the house, and then you end up being in debt. And so you borrow for the house, but also your business. It makes sense for the business to borrow. Why keep $1 million in cash? You just borrow as much as you can and try and stay as lean as you can. And then, well, I wouldn't say call it lean, but you stay as cash free as you
Yeah. You
possibly
just need
can.
to make sure the cash flow can cover the payments you have coming due.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you miss a couple of payments, it's a catastrophe. Like
Yeah.
if you were building a cash balance and you had savings, you miss a couple of payments, you draw down on your savings, which is not ideal, but you draw down on the savings and you still have savings. And unless you persist at doing erroneous money losing things for a long time, this can be sorted. You reverse course and you go back to accumulating saving. But in fiat, it doesn't make sense to have savings in the first place. So you borrow for your house, you borrow for your business, your government borrows, your every corporation everybody's borrowing, and everybody's a couple of paychecks away from being on the street. And it's this kind of Faustian bargain of fiat money, where everybody gets into this gambling mode, where we're gambling on all of those things. And so the winners from the gambling make more returns, and the result is that the losers from the gambling end up on the street, and
Yeah.
you have a
If you just
failing
save,
society.
you can't wind up on the yeah. Go ahead. You wind up on the losing end of it. I remember, I worked as a financial planner for a short stint. Well, before I realized it was more about sales than planning. I didn't last long in that. But what you'd see and what they show you is the biggest risk people face is not taking enough risk in the current system. If you just try to save and do it safely, you are going to fall behind. And so it forces, all these teachers or construction workers, people that have no interest in taking any risk, it forces them to take risk or they fall behind. And that's why the system's so diabolical.
I agree entirely, and it's why everybody's so stressed, in my opinion. It's also why people are so short-termist, because and it's a theme that runs through all my books and in the principles of economics as well. The hardness of money, the how hard your money is, how well the money can hold on to its value into the future, is a huge indicator for you about how secure you are in the future and what you can expect from the future, and your ability to provide for the future. So you become future oriented, which is reflected in all kinds of things. It's reflected in how you deal with your friends, how you deal with your family, your willingness to start a family and to invest in the future rather than to pursue only short term goals. Your willingness to say, work honestly, not cheat, not lie because you don't want to ruin your reputation. All of these things, they improve as people become more future oriented, and as money becomes harder, it improves. On the other hand, what we did in the 20th century, the way that I think of it, and for me, this is like a grand historical narrative, is that money was always getting harder throughout human history. Until the late 19th century, it was always getting harder. And so, because our money was getting harder, we were able to store more value and think more about the future. And as a result, our time preference decline. And we can see this reflected in interest rates. Interest rates continue to decline historically until in the end of the 19th century, they'd reached the level of only about 2%, which is a very low level. And we see this as a historical phenomenon. Of course, there are periods in which the interest rates go up, wars, diseases, famines, things like that. Bad things happen, so interest rates shoot up. But overall, there's a downward trend because people are becoming more civilized. They're accumulating more capital. They're thinking more about the future, so they become more moral and they have more capital. And so, therefore, because you have more capital, you I mean, the moral thing is separate, I would say, from the capital, but well, maybe not entirely separate. But there is, from the economic perspective in terms of interest rate, you see this process reflected as people are more future oriented, they save more. And because they save more, that causes the price of capital to decline. So interest rates decline in the long run. And so you see this happening up until the 20th century. And then the 20th century happens, and we shift from a money that increases at around 1.5% per year to a money that goes up at around 5, 10, 15, 20. Depends on where you are. It could be even 100, it could be 200, could be 500. We've had some enormous numbers over the years. But overall, I would say the average over the last 60 years, based on my calculations, is around 14% per year, the average fiat currency. The best fiat currencies do about 7, 8% per year in terms of their increase in their supply. So we went from 1.5% increase in the supply to 10, 15, 20% for the vast majority of humanity. And that basically means, the way that I think about it is that we were, I don't think I've ever framed it in this way, but I would say we've continued to progress as human beings, as an animal. We've continued to become lower time preference. We've continued to become more future oriented. And then the 20th century comes along, and we effectively go back to using this primitive money technology. So we're like these people whose brains can do computers and amazing things, but we're trying to, say, hunt with spear and
Yeah.
rock, and it's not going very well. All of our hunting and food production equipment has been replaced with spears and rocks, and we're out there trying to make food work for us. So obviously that's going to be disastrous. And it's something similar to what has happened with money. The money that we had was very advanced. It was gold. It was increasing at only at around 1.5% per year. It was doing well. It was allowing us to store for the future. Anybody in the world could save in that money. And that's what allowed us to build all of this amazing human civilization across the world. And then we go crazy and move up to a form of money that's constantly destroying our ability to save. And it's constantly stealing from us. And it's constantly financing a bunch of sociopaths to go around and shoot each other and us. Because they can, because they can afford to, and because it's just a way for sociopaths to have more control over society. And the results have been catastrophic, but I really think Bitcoin fixes this. Ultimately, this is what it comes down to. Bitcoin fixes this because Bitcoin's now increasing at only 0.8% per year, and it's open for anybody in the world, and everybody can use it, and we're going to see the whole world being Bitcoinized, I think, in our lifetime.
What was the most surprising thing for you in writing the Bitcoin Standard? Is I'm sure it involved a lot of study and a lot of research. What was the thing that you were kind of most like, wow, I hadn't thought about that before?
I'd say two things, and they're kind of related, but they're distinct concepts, although they're related. The first one is the central role of the difficulty adjustment, which really only really came to me as I was writing the book. And that's why I love writing. And I think it's such a great thing because it helps you clarify your ideas. So you think you understand something and you think you know how it works, but you haven't really understood it until you try to write it in a way that a stranger can understand it. Somebody who doesn't know you and is just reading this text and trying to make sense of this thing that you're explaining. If you try to do that and you try and read it with a stranger's eye, then you immediately start seeing all the limitations in your understanding. And then you need to build up the explanations. And the only way to do that is to develop the understanding yourself. So you manage to see all the gaps in your understanding by trying to write about something. And in turn, that allows you to correct them. It allows you to find the solution. It allows you to build this understanding into a product that other people can consume. So I would say, as I was doing this, as I was writing this book, I came across the importance of the difficulty adjustment. And it's not something that I had started off the book with, but ultimately it might be the most important idea in the book, or one of the most important ideas in the way in which the book is structured. And I think I mean, obviously I'm not the first person to talk about the difficulty adjustment, but I think I might be the first one to pinpoint this as the truly as the breakthrough of Bitcoin, and it's something that Adam Back agrees with me, who's somebody who's a lot more technically competent than me. But I really think this is an enormously significant technology because it takes Bitcoin from being a regular kind of software project into being the philosopher's stone of money. It takes it to being this is the best money that has ever been invented, purely because of the difficulty adjustment. And the difficulty adjustment just allows it to scale infinitely in terms of the value that it can hold. And it's just such a mind blowing conclusion. And I could only arrive at it after I'd written the Bitcoin standard, because after I'd come to the understanding of, first of all, the importance of the hardness of money and just being able to explain, which is something that, intuitively I understood as a gold bug because of gold.
Yeah.
But only when I sat down and wrote it and explained what happened with gold and understood what happened with silver. The other thing, yes, researching silver was another thing, and understanding that silver was the original analog shitcoin. That was another surprise. Little side note. But coming across all of these ideas and building up to the understanding of the importance of hardness of money, all of that allows me to then, when I'm trying to think about how Bitcoin works, explain why the supply of Bitcoin is so important to its function. And so then what explains that? And that's really how I try and explain the technical part of Bitcoin. And I think this is a great way of arriving at it, if I may say so myself, since I wrote the book. So obviously, I think it is. In that, explain the hardness of money and why this is such a big deal, and then show how this is solved as a software problem by creating this form of money where we have this magic little trick called difficulty adjustment. So that as more people try to produce the money, they're welcome to. Everybody can try. Everybody can try and be inflationist, but it's just going to get harder. And so therefore the supply is going to be limited by the increase in the difficulty of production to allow us to produce a supply that is completely predictable.
Yeah.
Which has held up for 15 years. It's absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, because of this magic trick, it doesn't matter that Bitcoin has gone from being 2 people to now maybe being 200 million people. Who knows?
Well, and I'm sure Satoshi didn't at that time think that there would be just warehouses around the world running miners mining Bitcoin, but it didn't matter because the difficulty adjustment was there.
Yeah, I wonder about that. I'm not so sure about it, actually. I think, and there was probably, he probably did have an idea that this was going to be a one node, one miner system. Just naturally, people are going to be mining and using the network. I'm not so sure that, but he does
But you
mention
think
data centers
he
at some
pictured
point.
it on this scale of them having these vast warehouses around the world that were.
I mean, he does mention at some point GPUs coming into mining and stuff. So it's not clear,
Yeah.
as far as I can tell from what I've read. It's not so clear. I could be wrong, but it's not so clear that he had envisioned this developing into this. But it's incredible that it has, and this is an enormous industry all over the world, and it's all governed by this difficulty algorithm that just determines how much they're all going to produce.
Well, I would tell all the Bitcoiners out there, I know almost all of them have read the Bitcoin standard, but I know a lot of them, like me, want to, had planned to read the Fiat standard and haven't gone around to it. I really do feel like the Bitcoin standard is what you give to somebody to help bring them into Bitcoin, but the Fiat standard is what you give to Bitcoiners who want to dive deeper and understand why, like what the real problems are that Bitcoin is solving for. And so definitely encourage everybody out there to make sure you get the Fiat standard. I actually think I like it more than the Bitcoin standard. I mean, they're 2 different books. The Bitcoin standard
Yeah.
just is very simple and eloquent and just takes people to to Bitcoin, but the Fiat standard for me was kind of mind opening in like all these different areas. So
Yeah, I think if I was to say so objectively, I would say probably the Fiat standard is the better book. Maybe the Bitcoin standard is my favorite. It's more life changing for me because it's
your first and
it's my first,
yeah.
and it's obviously sold more because a lot more people are curious about Bitcoin than they are about Fiat, at least initially. But I think if I were to think of it objectively, I'd say probably the Fiat standard is a better book. I mean, I obviously incorporated a lot of the feedback that I had received about the Bitcoin standard into it. But then the Principles of Economics, by the way, that
I have
third
not read
book,
that one yet, so
yeah, well, that
I'll have to
one
put that on the
took
list.
more work than the two first ones combined.
Okay.
Maybe even more work than the two of them together combined, more than twice. So that one I started before the Fiat standard and I finished it after the Fiat standard.
So it's kind of like you're on the you're having your own difficulty adjustment. Every book you write, it's the next one.
Exactly. Yes.
It's twice as hard.
Exactly. Well, I mean, you get more readers, so you have more people to
Yeah.
please, and you have to make it better to grab people's interest. So yeah, it is. The difficulty does increase with each level. Like I mean, it's you don't want to have a book that comes after a book and is inferior to
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
You don't want to be getting worse at it. You want to keep getting better at whatever it is that you're doing, and it's not just with books.
Definitely. Well, I actually have notes today. Usually I don't take notes when I'm podcasting, but I have some specific questions that I want to ask you just with El Salvador's adoption of Bitcoin in
Yes,
light
let's do
of
it.
what you've written about and what you think about. So there's a lot of people in the Bitcoin space that, think that using Bitcoin, spending Bitcoin is stupid and that it provides no value. You should only be saving it. And a lot of times they'll bring up Gresham's law that bad money will drive out good. From my understanding of that, what they're missing is in Gresham's law, that's you're assuming that there's an outside force that's kind of forcing the value of these two monies side by side. So, when they had coins that had less silver in them, they were saying they're worth the same and you have to accept them the same. So it'd be like in El Salvador, them saying, yes, you have to use Bitcoin and dollars, and Bitcoin's going to be at $5,000, like pegged. And of course, then nobody's going to use Bitcoin. They're going to use dollars. But I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on that. Do you think that, because reading in the Fiat standard, you talk about how the harder money is always going to win out over the long term, but there are gold had limitations as far as the being able to pass it through space and being able to send it and settle and all of those things. But Bitcoin really solves all of those issues. And so I guess in a long-winded way, I'm just asking, do you see over time Bitcoin pushing out the dollar in a place like El Salvador that's embraced both of those currencies?
I think so. I think it's going to happen at a global scale. Probably as along as it happens in a place like El Salvador, it might be difficult for a small country like El Salvador to be able to make this kind of switch. Ultimately, if the world is still predominantly on Bitcoin, sorry, the world is still predominantly on the dollar, but that just makes it a more lucrative opportunity for El Salvador to get in earlier and stack more sats. So I would say, I think what happens in the situation when you have these two currencies, when people talk about Gresham's law, you're absolutely correct. It's when the government is enforcing the use of an inferior money at a value equal to the superior money. So essentially, they're discounting or taxing the use of the superior money. In which case, people are going to take the superior money and send it abroad, and the money that is going to circulate domestically is the one that is inferior. But of course, in the long run, that doesn't really make the easier money able to beat the harder money. So, good example would be if you look at places where people are having very high inflation, like Turkey, or hyperinflation, like Venezuela. People don't want to pay with the US dollar at the prevailing exchange rate. The state mandated. Well, Turkey is probably a bad example. I think they generally have a free market. There's no black market there in the currency. So there's no, it wouldn't be an example of Gresham's law. But a place like Egypt, for instance, yeah, in Egypt, there's the official exchange rate, or in Argentina, I'm not sure if they still have that. They had it for a while. There's the official exchange rate, and there is the black market
Yeah.
exchange rate. And so in that world, nobody's going to actually pay the hotel bill or the restaurant bill or the coffee or lunch in the US dollar at the prevalent exchange rate, because you would be losing significant amount of money. You would be paying it, you would be selling your dollar at a price of, let's say, £20 per dollar, when you could go out on the street and find a guy who will pay you £40 per dollar, something like that. So in that situation, you would get people using the Egyptian pound or the Venezuelan bolivar rather than the dollar. But what is actually happening is that any real amount of money in the country is going to move to the dollar. And so the dollar is going to be the real currency, and then people are going to be using the local currency as a way to transact. Unless you bring back the free market rate, and then there's an equal rate, and then the local
Yeah.
currency has a fighting chance of maintaining survival. But otherwise, if you have a dual rate, you're just telling everybody to sell their local currency for the other one, and then they buy the local currency when they need it. So they hold the harder currency. So in the long run, the Venezuelan bolivar isn't going to drive out the US dollar. This is what it ultimately comes down to. This is the kind of way in which people sometimes misunderstand Gresham's law. And according to Gresham's law, in that understanding, the Venezuelan bolivar would drive out the dollar because it is crappy currency. But it doesn't. So ultimately, the whole world ends up having to use dollar because they are harder. And I think something similar is going to happen with Bitcoin. And the way that I see it, I think money is a cash balance technology. This is what it really works as. You buy money and you hold a cash balance. And your cash balance is the amount of cash that you're holding. And the more you accumulate of a cash balance, the more willing you are to spend. And so the more money you have, the more you can spend in a simple way. But also the more of any particular money you have, the more you are willing to spend of it. So if you have a lot of dollars, you are likely to spend from the dollars, not the Bitcoin. If you have, say, 1% allocation to Bitcoin, then spending a lot of, you're going to be spending the dollars. And so people's decision about what they want to spend is a function of their cash balances. So for me, the important thing is to build the cash balance in order to be able to spend. And trying to spend before building the cash balance, in my opinion, is counterproductive, likely. So a lot of people misunderstand this as saying you shouldn't ever spend your Bitcoin. This isn't what it's saying. It's saying you should stack harder. Yeah, you should stack harder, get more Bitcoin, so that you can only spend Bitcoin. Okay, if you're able to spend other things, you're short Bitcoin. Basically,
100%.
yeah,
100%.
you're stacking too much dollars.
Yeah.
If
That's why I was asked, so why do you have all these dollars still that you're trying to get rid of? You can always, there's all these available exchanges. It'd be one thing if everything was restricted, if you couldn't turn it into Bitcoin, but most of us have very easy access to trade whatever dollars we want into Bitcoin.
Exactly. And so in that situation, you're incurring a devaluation of the dollar by holding on to large quantities of dollars. But the more dollars you hold on to, the easier it is to spend from dollars. And ultimately, a lot of us have a lot of dollars to spend because a lot of our life is still in the fiat world. And sometimes some of our earnings are in the fiat world. So therefore, the more you need to do this, the more you have to stack dollars. And so the more you have to hold dollar balances, the more devaluation you have. But then if you spend Bitcoin, then the less of a cash balance in dollars you need to have, and the more you can be in the harder, better money.
Well, that's what I love about being here in El Salvador. Pretty much everything we can do in Bitcoin. So I don't really need to hold dollars, except, the occasional thing, or if I'm going back to the US or something like that. But in general, and people like, oh, that's stupid. You shouldn't never spend your Bitcoin. You should spend your dollars. I'm like, why are you holding all these dollars? That's what I keep trying to get across to them. It's like, just hold less dollars. And I understand not everybody's in this situation where they have places that accept Bitcoin, but if you have the opportunity at certain places to pay in Bitcoin, that allows you to move more and more of your life over to a Bitcoin standard.
Exactly. And I think, I can understand why you might want to hold dollars because you have bills to pay and, for things that are critical, and if you don't have a big margin of savings, so let's say you're spending a significant amount of your income, then in that situation, you want to have a buffer of fiat for expenses that happen over the next month or 2 or 3. But it's important not to get too lazy about this and keep stacking more and more fiat because you're getting robbed. So you need to be careful. This is when you put it in fiat, it's a melting ice cube. So you only take out the ice cubes that you really need to use and try and spend them as quickly as you can before they melt. The longer you
But trying not to acquire more, because a lot of people say that, well, I want to spend this as quick, but then they're acquiring a bunch more at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah. So ultimately, It's really just trying about it's about trying to increase your cash balance in Bitcoin, and then those things, and then the amount of spending you will do in Bitcoin will naturally increase. And as the price of Bitcoin goes up, its composition as part of your cash balances should go up naturally. So if you want to be conservative about exiting fiat into Bitcoin, and you want to keep a significant amount of expenditure for, say, next 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year, or maybe even 2 years in fiat, well, that's only going to get smaller as a part of your wealth. Although, of course, if your expenditure go up more than Bitcoin goes up, against it goes the other way. But you should probably not be increasing your spending as fast as Bitcoin is going
Yeah.
up. You probably shouldn't. Generally, it's a very fast rate of increase. So you should be stacking harder anyway. But generally, yeah, that's as the price of Bitcoin goes up, its composition in your cash balances goes up. So your likelihood of spending Bitcoin also goes up. And similarly, as the price goes up, so the value of Bitcoin and its and its percentage as part of the composition of people's cash balances overall increases. That means the likelihood that you will come across somebody who has Bitcoin and is willing to accept Bitcoin also begins to increase. So currently, about 1% of the world's cash balances, maybe 0.5% of the world's cash balances, depends on how you calculate it, is in Bitcoin. So the odds that something that you want to buy is going to be in Bitcoin anywhere in the world is like 0.5%. So for most people, it's not worth asking. But as number go up, technology does its thing. That 0.5% becomes 1%, 2%, 5%, 10%. At some point, it gets to 50%, 60%. And at that point, it makes more sense for most people around the world to accept Bitcoin as money.
The other thing that I always try to challenge people with is I think moving to a Bitcoin standard actually helps you be a wiser consumer, because when you have to, when you're just throwing cash at something, you're like, well, it's just gonna be worth less in the future anyways. But when you're spending on Bitcoin, you're questioning, do I really need this now, or can I wait? Because a
This
year
could be
from now, I
Satoshis.
think I could buy much more with it. And so
Exactly.
I think it actually helps us be wiser consumers, and that trickles into all kinds of other things that you see that you dive into in the fiat standard, just how our food and the environment, all these things have been debased by easy money. But if we bring it back to living on Bitcoin standard, we don't need as much. We make different choices.
Absolutely. I really believe that is the case.
So I won't hold you too much longer because I know you have a big event to do here tonight in El Zonte. But I'm curious as to what you see the path for other countries coming to Bitcoin. Do you think that they will, like El Salvador, first come to the dollar, or maybe not in an officially dollarized, but because of stable coins, they will de facto dollarize, which will lead to their governments being willing to give up the fiat printers? Or do you think that it'll happen in a variety of ways? I'm just curious as to your thoughts as to what the dollar Bitcoin interplay
no, I
is.
think that's an interesting question. I don't really have an answer because I don't have a crystal ball. But I think I can see the case for why that might happen. I think in most of the world, people would benefit from having something like the US dollar, because the only other alternative that they have, or not the only, but the alternative that they think they have, the only alternative they think they have is their local shitcoin, which is usually terrible. It's even worse than the dollar. If you don't like the dollar, you should try the other fiats and then see how bad they are. So, as somebody who is not a sociopath who likes to see human beings suffer, I cannot be unhappy about somebody upgrading from a currency that goes up at 30% per year in terms of its supply to a currency that only goes up 7% a year in terms of its supply. I mean, it's a natural, rational decision that anybody should be able to take. Obviously, we would be much better if they would go to a currency that goes up at 0.8% per year and declining. But ultimately, not everybody's gonna make it in life. Some people are just gonna make wrong decisions. What are you gonna do? And I think realistically, there is, the kind of politically correct answer here, or the kind of dispassionate economist answer, would be ultimately people are going to realize this one goes up better, and because the supply goes down, goes up slower, and so they will rationally go to that. But realistically, it's more of a Darwinian process in that it's financial survival of the fittest. In that, if you upgrade to 7% and you sit on your laurels and you think 7% is great, people who upgraded to 0.8% are just going to continue to grow their wealth while you don't. And so this is why I don't have much of a whole let's go out and evangelize and tell people about this, because and why I'm kind of tempted to say have fun staying poor regularly, because this is what it ultimately comes down to. Like, my book explains it, why this is better,
Yeah.
and why this makes you poor and why this makes you
But
rich.
your book is, in a way, evangelizing it. I mean, you are helping bring people into the system. So in
Yeah,
a
but
way,
I'm
you are
exactly.
a
So
Bitcoin
my book
evangelist.
explains it, and so if you're interested in this question, then you can go and read the book. But beyond that, I mean, if you insist on continuing to use your government's shitcoin,
Yeah, it's your choice.
who am I to disagree? So I mean, I'd love it if people would do this. If anybody asks me, I would tell them. But I'm at some level, this idea that we need to be worried about it and we need to do things. This is a red flag for me, because usually it's people are trying to intervene and do things that are nasty. They resort to scaremongering, and realistically, there is no reason to scaremonger, because ultimately, sad reality is, I mean, if people don't choose it, they get poorer, and the people who do choose it keep just getting better off financially. So that's an unsustainable equilibrium as it is. We can't just continue to be a niche currency that grows in value. If it grows in value, it eventually stops being niche,
Yeah.
and it outgrows the other one that is declining in value. And that's ultimately how I see it.
Where do you see El Salvador being 10 years from now, having adopted Bitcoin as legal tender and making these other moves to, drive Bitcoin education? I think you've been involved with that some. Where do you think that will leave El Salvador, kind of as coming from a very poor country that nobody really cared about to potentially being a powerful player in the world?
I'm reluctant to think about it in terms of a powerful player, because I think Bitcoin makes you more rational than trying to get into stupid geopolitical
Yeah, not power
games.
from like a military, but just as
Yeah.
like an economic might. The place that attracts people, attracts capital, is a place that people are
Exactly.
coming to rather than fleeing
Exactly, and so if for a country to prosper and progress, it does not need to dominate other countries. It needs to collaborate with other countries. Something that Mises explains beautifufully, which I discuss in Principles of Economics. That peace and cooperation is what is needed, and I think in a place like El Salvador, I would bet, as a kind of corollary of my work, in this place, what we're seeing is that people are moving to a form of money that is harder than other places. So if we do, in fact, say 10 years from now, if we see that the average person in El Salvador has more of a cash balance than in Bitcoin than the average person from Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, the surrounding similar countries, then I'd say if it would be very interesting to see how El Salvador is different from these other countries. And I would expect it would be different, because people would accumulate more Bitcoin. They'd start being able to save. And because they're able to save, they start becoming more future oriented, and they become less present oriented and less of slaves to their immediate desires, and more of a long term focused, rational human being, able to sublimate, if that's the correct word, their desires to their rational thinking. And so this would mean more cooperation, more peace. Obviously, the gang war helps. That's a major confounding factor. But it's not so much a confounding factor, I would say, because it is not unrelated to that. The fact that the same political leadership that believes in Bitcoin and can see the value proposition in Bitcoin can also conduct something like the war on gangs and believe in the long-term benefit from doing something so politically unpopular, at least internationally. Obviously, it's politically popular domestically, but also hugely risky from a security perspective. I think one part of it that is underestimated, people don't talk about enough, just how courageous it is for the current leadership, President Bukele, to do this, because he set the people of El Salvador free. And they can walk in the streets, they can live very easy, very secure lives. But for him personally, it is not the case, because a lot of people are angry at him because he's made a lot of enemies amongst the correct enemies, I would say, but they're still enemies. And this is an enormous amount of sacrifice for him to take, but it is the right thing to do. And it is, for me, it's no coincidence that it is a Bitcoiner who thinks this way, because he can think long term.
Yeah.
Whereas all the fiat politicians are focused on the short term, and they're unable to think beyond what's going to win me the next election, what's going to,
Or how to enrich themselves
or
and
how,
loot the
exactly,
country.
or how do I get richer?
Yeah.
How do I get more money into my Swiss bank account? Because they haven't discovered Bitcoin. If they discover Bitcoin, they don't need a Swiss bank account, and they stop being corrupt.
Well, I think that's a good note to wrap up on. Is there anything else that you want to say about El Salvador, or and then obviously want to let know, other than the books that you have, I believe you have like a teaching
Well, I've got my
institute.
podcast, the Bitcoin Standard Podcast. You can
Okay,
listen to
yeah.
that, an episode every week. And I've also got my website where I teach online courses on Bitcoin and Austrian economics. So my third book, Principles of Economics, I'm now finishing up the course. You can
What's
join
that website?
Saifedean.com.
Okay.
So you can join the course, and now we have an app as well. You can download the app and watch the courses and take the courses on the app. And you can also join the live seminars. Twice a week we have live seminars where we discuss the material of the course.
Sweet. So what's your agenda while you're here in El Salvador, other than the event tonight?
I'm going to get a lot of beach. I am looking forward to getting a lot of salt water on my body.
All right, that's what you got to do while you're here. Well, I appreciate you taking a little time to come into the studio.
My
For
pleasure.
me, it's
Thank you for
been
having me.
a real privilege, and I'm glad I was able to ask some of these questions, because it's living here in El Salvador, seeing the country, the first one to adopt Bitcoin, and see how some of these things play out. There's people that say, it's not really happening, or it's happening too slow. For me, it's happening a lot faster than I expected, just because people are creatures of habit, and these things usually take decades to change. And so here
Yeah.
it feels like we're on warp speed, but
Yeah, absolutely. It does.
it's
nice to pay for your taxi in Bitcoin, I got to say.
yeah, it's funny. My wife, I always joke, because she always tells people that she's not a Bitcoiner. I'm like, you spend more in Bitcoin than 99% of people at Bitcoin conferences. Just because it's not all you think about, you're a Bitcoiner. You actually know how to use it. Use
Yeah.
it in your everyday life.
It's great. I think this is what we need. We need more users of Bit. I mean, we don't really need them. They don't have to come, but it's good to see people just use Bitcoin without the baggage and ideology that comes with it. That is just a useful tool.
Which is
that
the
they
easiest
use.
thing to use. Like,
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
the, like, I'll get a text from my kid.
Because
That's like,
that's how we win. We're not going
Yeah.
to win because we have dedicated libertarians who want to separate
no,
money from
that's
the
a
state.
small percentage of the people that come because of that.
We are going to win because we have better money.
Yeah.
And they're going to use it because it's better. That's it. They're not going to use it because they've read Rothbard.
Exactly. All right. Well, let's get you out in the ocean so you can get
Awesome.
rested up for tonight's event.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.